This program's about the problem of universals, sometimes called the problem of the one and the many. There are many beautiful things, say, but there is one thing, beauty, which they have in common, or share, or manifest, or something. Philosophers call the many things particulars, and the one thing they call the universal. How are they, the particulars and the universal, how are they related? I call many things beautiful. I use the same one word of many things. What justifies me in doing so? That's the problem, or at least one way of putting it. It's a problem that's been with us for a very long time, at least as far back as Plato. But in this program, we're going to consider whether a comparatively recent philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, whether he said anything that helps to solve it. Wittgenstein was professor of philosophy here in Cambridge from 1939 to 1947. He died in 1951. He's a philosopher of very great influence. Even people who don't agree with him won't deny that. And there are people who don't agree with him. One of them is Stephan Kerner, professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol and at Yale. In this program, Professor Kerner is going to be discussing Wittgenstein and the problem of universals with Renford Bamborough, Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. They'll be debating in Mr. Bamborough's rooms here in St. John's College. We'll discuss this passage in the Blue Book. We're inclined to think that there must be something in common to all games, say, and that this common property is the justification for applying the general term game to the various games, whereas games form a family, the members of which have family likenesses. That passage in the Blue Book, and then the passages in the Brown Book around about page 130, where he's talking about different senses of have something in common. Let's start with the question as to, Renford, do you agree with what Wittgenstein says about our use of the word game?
I do, and I think that to have pointed that out is an important achievement in the history of philosophy, because the question to which Wittgenstein is addressing himself, though he doesn't say so, is the question that Socrates was concerned with when he looked for definitions of familiar terms like justice and knowledge and courage. He always assumed in these searches that the answer would take the form of finding what the common element or essence or ingredient is in all the cases to which the word applies. Wittgenstein is pointing out that here is one word, game, which has a perfectly rational, comprehensible application to a set of objects that have no single feature or ingredient or essence in common. Mm-hmm. He's therefore giving a new direction to the search for an answer to the ancient problem of universals, the problem of the one and the many. What is the one characteristic that these many particular games, books, acts of justice have in common? And I think that one might, with a pardonable exaggeration, say that Wittgenstein was giving us the road to the solution that the genius of Socrates propounded in asking what is it for a lot of things to be of the same kind.
Stephan, do you think that this, what applies to the word game, applies to other concepts, or do you think there are exceptions to this?
No, I would say, I would agree with you that Wittgenstein may have shown us the road towards a solution. But if I have to judge what he said, I would have two objections. I would first of all say that Wittgenstein seems to think that all concepts, or sometimes talks as if all concepts were family resemblance concepts. Mm-hmm. That is, that as if in all cases what connects the instances of a concept with each other, by reason of which connection we say that there are instances of these concepts, is always family resemblance. whereas in fact there are lots and lots of systematic connections which are not like family resemblance. Let me give you examples. If I say that 1, 7, 399 and all the integers fall under the concept integer because they have family resemblance, we say something which is just as empty, or I would say more empty, than to say that they have something in common. Because I would find it much more illuminating if the answer were an integer is 1 or any number derived from 1 by a single or iterated addition of 1. So that's one objection which I have to what Wittgenstein says or seems to say. And the other objection is that even his analysis of family resemblance concepts is not complete, that there's much more to be said.
What more would you want to say?
Well, I would first of all like to say that family resemblance concepts, unlike other concepts, are inexact in the sense that they have borderline cases. That for any family resemblance concept or any concept with which he is concerned, like red, there are always inner cases or positive cases, outer cases or negative cases, and borderline cases.
Yes.
That's one thing which I think should be emphasized, and it should be emphasized that, for example, integers are not like that. There are no borderline cases between integer and non-integer, as there is between red and not red,
Yes.
or between prime number and not prime number.
So that we have two points. We have the one about it being possible to define some concepts, not game, not red, but
Yes.
perhaps integer. And the second point about there being some concepts, the family resemblance concepts, as you call them, which have borderline cases.
Yes, and there is more to it, if I may continue.
Yes.
And that is, you see, if we attend to the borderline cases, we attend to a related very important fact, namely that the instances of these concepts, family resemblance concepts and red, whether it is a family resemblance concept or not, are continuously connected. That means, take for instance red. Then between red and not red, there are common borderline cases. Every species, every shade of red, like light red, has common borderline cases with its complement, not light red. And that in terms of these common borderline cases, we can define different types of continua, empirical continua. You see, and we would have, for instance, multidimensional and one-dimensional. You see, game seems to be multidimensionally continuous, whereas red, well, if you like, not less than two-dimensionally continuous. Do you see what I mean?
I think that whist and bridge are on one continua. Am I right?
Well, you see, it would, of course, one would have to develop, as some people, including myself, Brentano, for instance, including myself also, have tried to do, one would have to develop this theory of continuous connection, which is not dealt with in Wittgenstein, and which I think is very important to an understanding of family resemblance concepts.
Do you have to disagree with this, though, Rent?
I agree that the work on empirical continuity that Stefan Kerner has done is a very important addition to what Wittgenstein did. Where I disagree is in Stefan's earlier remarks about family resemblances. I think there are many dimensions in which games can be compared one with another, and this is a point that Wittgenstein himself makes. I think that what Stefan Kerner is engaged in his inquiry into empirical continuities is a branch of philosophical research related to what Wittgenstein was concerned with, and that can quite properly be carried on as a supplement to what Wittgenstein said. I think, however, that Wittgenstein's concern in the passages that we are dealing with was with the ancient problem of the one and the many, and that his example of game, and his treatment of the example of red for that matter, brings to light a substantial point about that old controversy, namely that the instances that fall under a general term don't need to have any factor or ingredient in common.
Yes.
And though it's quite true that there are fundamental differences between the property of being game and the property of being read, they are not ones that unfit either of those properties for being a good example for Wittgenstein's purpose, since in the Brown Book he asks what is in common between a light red and a dark red, and clearly expects the answer either that there's nothing in common, or, and I think it's the same point though put rather differently, that the only thing that they have in common is that they are red, and that Socrates' ambition of finding something distinct from their both being red,
Yes.
which would somehow underlie and account for the fact of their both being red, is a wild goose chase.
I agree with this, but I also agree very wholeheartedly with your saying that what I'm trying to do is to supplement this sketchy account of Wittgenstein's. And I think that it is relevant to the problem of universals to show the kind of systematic connections between the instances of a concept and the concept. This really is to fulfill what he says, the request of not falling victim to generalizations, you see. So I'm here a good Wittgensteinian, and I think Wittgenstein, in concentrating on one kind, probably was a bad Wittgensteinian there.
Yes, so you're endorsing the point I made earlier when I suggested that what Wittgenstein was showing, among other things,
Yes.
is that the notion of having something in common
Yes.
is itself one to which Wittgenstein's account of what it is
Yes.
for things to have something in common has a
Yes.
clear application.
I think that that point about different senses of have something in common is one of the most important points that Wittgenstein makes in this part of the Brown Book.
Well, I think that having something in common doesn't tell us much, that it just indicates a general direction in which we should go, that it indicates at best that we should look for systematic connections.
Yes, but suppose I were to ask, what do these three objects have in common?
Well,
And I point to three objects. Now,
Yes.
there's a very obvious answer.
Yes,
But they're
well-
all books.
yes, I was thinking they are all colored objects, you see. But I think I agree, they are all books, and now we would say this, and then we would you would say what have all integers in common, and what have all chairs in common, and we would say that they belong to different systematic connections.
Yes, but suppose I were to go on with my books for a minute.
Yeah.
Suppose I were now to ask, what do all these books have in common?
Yes.
Now, this time, it's no good you're saying that they're books,
No,
because
they are
I've already said that they're books.
Yes,
You
yes.
must look for something else. Now, it happens that they're all philosophical books.
good.
So there is a property that they all have in common.
Surely,
Now,
surely.
suppose we extend that question, just extend its range.
Please.
Suppose we now ask, what do all books have in common?
Well, and the answer is they have a family resemblance in common, because books, I think, is very much a book. Is very much the concept which to which Wittgenstein's analysis fits so well. There are some such concepts, and there are others to which it is wholly unilluminating.
Yes, but I think the importance of this
Yeah.
observation you just made about books is this, that Socrates and his followers,
Yes.
including nearly all of us at
Yes.
all times,
Yes.
thought that the question, what do all books have in
Yes.
common, was to be answered on lines analogous to those on which we answer the question,
Yes.
what do these three books have in common?
Correct.
He thought there were interesting features that
Yes.
could be found,
Yes.
which would specify the character of all books, in which
Yes.
in the way in which I specified the character of these three by saying that they were all philosophical or all belong to me or something of that kind. Now, this can't be done. This is what
No,
Wittgenstein
I
noticed.
agree
That
very
the
much.
the only point that connects all books together,
Yes.
the only true remark that can be made about
Yes.
what all books have in
Yes.
common is that they're books.
Yes.
And that's so fatuous and boring
Yes.
that philosophers have always said
Yes.
more interesting things, such as that they're all
Yes.
related to the form of
Yes.
book in heaven,
Yes.
or that they all have an ingredient bookness. Now, these more interesting
Yes.
things are all false. Wittgenstein showed us the one
Yes.
true thing, the
Yes.
very boring thing,
Yes.
that they are related to each
Yes.
other in that way that makes them all books.
But if somebody, say a student, not you, came along and tried to use this Wittgenstein approach to numbers and said that 1, 3, 375 have a family resemblance in common, that would be also fatuous.
Yes.
And this is, you see, and my point really, and I don't think we disagree, was to say there are family resemblance concepts, There are non-family resemblance concepts, and family resemblance concepts, like the others, can still do with much more analysis than Wittgenstein gave them in these remarks.
I think from the point of view of our concern with the ancient one and many problem, the important fact is that even in these other cases of systematic connection that you're pointing out, the systematic connection doesn't take the form that Socrates thought it would take of there being a single ingredient that was common to all the instances.
I quite agree.
I think we should put some emphasis on this expression, have something in common, or common ingredient. I mean, it seems to me that there are literal senses of have something in common, and that by drawing attention to them, we see something about the rather more metaphorical senses of have something in common, where we say that two red things have something in common.
Doesn't it bring us to the other passage?
Yes, we're there already.
We are there already,
I mean, what I have in mind is, well, if allow me to make a sort of demonstration here.
Good.
On the Brown Book, keys, glasses, and coins. One display. Now another one. And I ask, what had the two displays in common? Answer, the glasses. That's one perfectly, absolutely literal sense of have something in common.
Sure.
Now, if you remember that, and then say that these three objects have something in common, in that they're all books, or three red things, tulips and a calendar and something else, have something in common, in that they're all red, then you realize that the expression have something in common is being used in different senses. Whether you call one literal and the other metaphorical, I don't mind, but they're being used in different senses, and this casts some light on the sort of explanation that is offered of our applying the same word, the same general word, to a number of different things, which consists in saying that we do so because they have something in common, or because we see that they have something in common. And it seems to me that this is one of the main points which Wittgenstein is making in the Brown Book, anyway.
Well, as with many of the expressions that it's natural to use in talking about this problem, I feel drawn in two opposed ways. One can put the point, as Wittgenstein sometimes puts it, by saying that we don't need a justification for applying the word, and mean by that we don't need the sort of justification that Socrates thought we always needed.
Yes.
But one could equally put the same point, and this is what makes the presentation of philosophy so confusing, by saying that, of course, we need a justification, and we have it, but it doesn't take the form that Socrates thought it had to take. And I think this is quite characteristic of philosophical problems, that the things we are naturally inclined to say always need a corrective from something else that we're naturally inclined to say. The problem arises from there being a conflict between one thing that it's natural to say and another thing that is equally natural to say. So we identify here three different things, and yet the very use of the word identify suggests that we relate them in a way. Now, there are three distinct objects and three objects of the same kind. So there we have what Plato talked about, the one and the many, the same and the different. And philosophers have been at war with each other because both sides in these wars have thought that either the identity must win the day or the difference, either the plurality or the unity. Wittgenstein, perhaps more than any other philosopher of recent centuries, has helped us to see that we can combine the emphasis on the unity that impresses some philosophers with an emphasis on the plurality that impresses others.
What I would say is that when I call a book, an integer, a chair, I have a reason. And it is my task as a philosopher to make this reason explicit. I may not know the reason, but I think the problem of universals and philosophical problems in general are concerned with making explicit assumptions which are implicit. If somebody said to me that you are calling this book a book without any explicit or implicit reason, then I would say this clearly is not my opinion.
And Wittgenstein, I think, would say that we must discuss what the difference is between an explicit reason and an implicit reason, the sort of reason a person cannot have without knowing he has
Yes.
it, and the sort of reason which he can have without knowing it.
That is a very interesting question, and his problem is not incompatible with mine. I am more interested in the first than in the second, which I think is largely psychological.
I think we can get clearer about the technique here if we think of a passage in the Investigations where he talks about family resemblances and again about games, and says, don't insist that there's something in common.
Yes.
Don't think about the matter and conclude that there's something in common.
Yes.
Look and see whether there is.
Yes.
Now, one can imagine somebody parodying this remark. Here is Wittgenstein, the great obscurantist philosopher, telling his pupils not to think.
Yes. Well,
Whereas what he's doing by saying don't think is opposing the assumption one is liable to make about what is the appropriate form of thought here. And one might take a parallel from a perfectly non-philosophical context. Suppose the golf professional advising the poor amateur says, you're trying too hard. Don't try so hard.
yes.
Now, he doesn't want that golfer to give up making an effort.
No.
He wants him to make a better directed effort,
That's
an
right.
effort fitter for the task in hand. Now, when Wittgenstein says, don't think,
Yes.
he means, even if he's not aware of the
Yes.
fact, think in a manner more appropriate for this kind of problem.
Yes.
And when he says there is no justification,
Yes.
he at least sometimes means
Yes.
there isn't anything of the only kind that
Yes.
you, the reader, or
Yes.
Socrates, will
Yes.
count as a justification. But that doesn't mean that we are not justified. As he says in one place,
Yes.
to use a word without a justification is not to use it without right, is
Good.
not to be unjustified in using it.
I agree if you say without explicit justification. And to come back to your golf example, and I don't play golf, but if I did play golf, I would, as a philosopher, be very interested in making explicit the rules of golf. You see, in making explicit the reasons for my beautiful play doing the stroke, in showing what the rules of golf are to which this beautiful stroke, without my knowing, conforms.
So long as you were willing to recognize that the professional who wasn't as good as you are at making things explicit was
Yes.
better at golf.
Oh, sure,
And,
but
equally, we don't have to be
Yes.
as explicit
Yes.
and articulate as Socrates hoped we might become
Yes.
in order to be extremely efficient users of our language and our concepts.
Oh, I entirely agree.
On that note of agreement that philosophers may at least succeed in making explicit the rules of golf, Stephen Kerner, Renford Bamborough, thank you.